Man, few films are as relentlessly cruel as Hereditary. Yeah, there are other movies about satanic cults that gaslight and exploit victims as vessels for demonic births or possessions, but Ari Aster's debut really takes the mercilessness to a whole other level, and he does it by cleverly invoking the past. It's a common trope in horror films for history to re-emerge and haunt the present. In Candyman, the sins of slavery and racial violence return to enact terror on modern-day Chicago. In The Fog, vengeful spirits of murdered sailors wreak havoc on a town that has prospered from their stolen wealth, etc. And while it isn't immediately obvious that Hereditary is operating in this tradition, it is. Kinda. But here, it's not about figures or settings coming back to spread misery, it's an entire worldview, one that is much more ancient and ruthless. So why is it that watching Hereditary is like a sledgehammer to the back of the head? Is it Toni Collette's haunting performance? Is it Charlie's eerie clicking? Or is it something even more insidious, that maybe our modern frameworks of understanding the world are completely useless? Well, to find out, we're gonna have to dive deep into Ari's deranged mind, and also pay a little visit to our old buddy Friedrich. Let's dive in. But first, a quick recap. Meet the Grahams, Annie, Steve, Peter, and Charlie. When Annie's overbearing mother Ellen passes away, most of the family feels, well, not much.
Should I be sadder?
Except for the unsettling Charlie, who had a strong connection with Ellen and misses her dearly. At a support group, Annie reveals a family history of severe mental illness and tragedy. Meanwhile, Charlie's behavior becomes increasingly bizarre, from arts and crafts with dismembered bird heads to seeing visions of Ellen. One night, Annie forces Peter to bring Charlie to a party where an allergic reaction to nuts triggers a desperate rush to the hospital. In a moment of sheer panic, Peter accidentally decapitates Charlie in a horrific car accident that sends the entire family spiraling into depression. Desperate for help, Annie returns to the support group where she meets Joan, a sympathetic soul who teaches Annie how to conduct a seance to communicate with Charlie. Annie tries it at home, but it isn't until she learns that both Ellen and Joan were part of a cult trying to summon the demon Payman into a human host that she realizes the seance invited a dark presence into her home, and Peter is its target. Annie tries to foil the cult's plans, but every effort just hurts more members of her family and drives Payman closer to Peter. Peter's terrifying visions intensify, and eventually Annie is completely subsumed by the demonic influence. In the end, the cult succeeds, forcing Peter's spirit out of his body and allowing Payman to fully take control. Inside Charlie's treehouse, the cult bows before their new leader. Hail Payman, the end. Now, before I break it down, I want to tell you guys about this video's sponsor, Mando. With summer around the corner, staying fresh all day is a must, and Mando has got you covered. Nobody likes to talk about it, but body odor happens. Mando is a whole body deodorant that works anywhere you need it. Pits, feet, and those harder to reach areas. Mando was created by a doctor who realized that BO was often misdiagnosed, and her product is clinically proven to control odor better than soap alone. Studies show that 12 hours after a shower, the average odor level is a 5 out of 10, but with Mando, it's a 0. I use Mando before work, after the gym, on long walks with my dog, and even before heading to the movies. I'm at the theater at least twice a week these days, and a sold-out screening can be the optimal experience, but not if you're sitting next to someone with brutal BO. But with Mando, I don't have to worry about being that guy. I stay fresh and confident the whole runtime. They got 4 scents: bourbon leather, clover woods, Mount Fuji, Pro Sport, plus an unscented option. It's powered by mandelic acid, so it stops odor before it even starts and lasts up to 72 hours. Mando's starter pack bundle is a great deal for new customers. It comes with a full-size stick deodorant, a cream deodorant tube or spray deodorant, and 2 free products like the wipes or mini body wash. Plus free US shipping, and just for my followers, Mando is offering an extra $5 off when you order by clicking the link in the description below and enter the code Jared at checkout. That's a deal of over 40% off. And now, back to the show. You know, sometimes filmmakers can't help themselves. A seeming favorite of every screenwriter is the teacher directly expressing the theme during a lecture scene.
Chemistry is the study of change. It is growth, then decay, then transformation.
In Knowing, it's here.
But that's a nice thought, right? Everything has a purpose, an order to it, is determined.
In Half Nelson, it's here.
And what's change?
It's opposites. It's two things that push against each other in opposite direction.
And in Hereditary, it's here.
So he thinks he has control. But let's all remember, Sophocles wrote the oracle so that it was unconditional, meaning Heracles never had any choice, right?
Mr. Davies is teaching the Sophocles tragedy, The Women of Trachis. The Women of Trachis follows Deianira, the wife of the great hero Heracles, as she desperately tries to prevent a prophecy from coming true, only to unknowingly fulfill it. Fearing she is losing Heracles to another woman, she sends him a robe anointed with what she thinks is a love potion, but it's actually poisoned, causing his death. In her despair, she takes her own life, while Heracles, realizing too late that his suffering was fated by the gods, resigns himself to his destiny. Like Heracles and Deianira, Peter and Annie think they have control over their lives, but everything is being orchestrated by a higher power. While it's never entirely clear how and if every event was engineered, the film heavily suggests the cult's influence is far-reaching, pre-planning everything to prepare Peter as a host for Paimon. Although Peter was her initial target, Annie kept Ellen far away from him, allowing her to be a primary maternal figure to Charlie instead.
I didn't let her anywhere near me when I had my son, which is why I gave her my daughter, who she immediately stabbed her hooks into.
And although Ellen would have preferred Charlie to be a viable host,
she wanted me to be a boy.
She still uses her as a means to get to Peter. So while it may seem that Annie thwarting her mom's plans was a successful step toward evading fate, those decisions still led Paimon to Peter. There's cryptic, demonic words written on the walls, and notice here, when Annie spills the paint, her hand doesn't go anywhere near the bottle. A mysterious force is drawing her attention to the note with Joan's phone number on it. The pole that decapitates Charlie bears the cult symbol, and when Annie visits Joan, she finds a piece of walnut residue in her tea, implying that even this freak accident was premeditated in order to make Peter more vulnerable and Annie desperate enough to perform the seance. Like the figures of a Greek tragedy, the Grahams were fated. This is most vividly portrayed through Annie's miniatures. The film is bookended by shots framing the story within the context of her creations. In the opening, the camera starts on a treehouse, a type of miniature, and then zooms into an actual miniature where Peter wakes up, while the final shot abruptly transitions to the cult worshipping Peter/Paimon within the treehouse, framed as another miniature. The idea is, just as Annie arranges scenarios with figurines devoid of agency, the cult manipulates the Graham family in the same way. But it wouldn't be entirely accurate to say the film wholesale adopts the logic of a Greek tragedy. There's a key difference that can help us understand Hereditary's uniquely brilliant cruelty. And for that, we're gonna have to philosophize a little bit with a hammer. In 1872, Nietzsche published The Birth of Tragedy, which is really more about the death of tragedy. In it, he laments the declining relevance of tragedy due to the rise of reason and conscious intelligence that originated with Socrates. A century later, playwright Lionel Abel, building off of Nietzsche, made the claim that it's virtually impossible to write a tragedy anymore because all of our characters are too self-aware. Basically, we no longer have figures driven by instinct and fate like Antigone, Oedipus, and Orestes. Now they're all like Hamlet, highly reflective and burdened by the intellectual scrutiny of his own actions. This self-aware theatrics Abel calls meta-theater, where characters have to grapple with and question their own awareness. Annie's miniatures are a literal manifestation of meta-theater, as she uses them as a stage to recreate pivotal moments of her life, such as her mother's death, her mother breastfeeding Charlie, and Charlie's accident. She's essentially framing herself and her loved ones as characters on a stage, trying to get a bird's eye view of her suffering to alleviate its impact on her through analysis.
No, it's a neutral view of the accident.
What Nietzsche and then Abel were identifying wasn't just a shift in writing, but a hallmark of the modern condition. We're obsessed with understanding ourselves and our experiences, seeking control through introspection and rationalization. Charlie's Classroom even celebrates the importance of critical thinking. These days, if we believe in any idea of fate, it's not a metaphysical inevitability like it was for Sophocles. It's something that we come about through reason, like, for example, the idea of a hereditary illness, something ingrained in your genes that influences or maybe even dictates your decisions. Thus, the title of the movie, a play on a modern concept of fate. And essentially, the film revolves around this question of which kind of fate is dooming the Grahams, a mystical, classical concept of fate, or a modern genetic concept of fate. What explains these supernatural visions? Is it the cult or inherited mental illness? Steve is quite sure it's a hereditary illness.
You are sick.
But nope, there really is a cult. Classical fate rears its head in a time when we only think about rational fate. Hereditary exists at the intersection of tragedy and metatheater. It's tragic in the sense that the characters are ensnared by forces beyond their control, but it's also metatheater in that their pretense to freedom is in their ability to rationalize, analyze, and work through their pain. And the film's masterstroke is how this very attempt at self-understanding is what dooms the Grahams. Let's return to Mr. Davies, who poses an important question.
So does that make it more tragic or less tragic that if he has a choice?
While Peter's classmates and scholars disagree about Sophocles, I'd argue, in the Grahams' case, having no choice clearly makes it more tragic, because in an age where self-awareness reigns, questioning our agency also calls into question the very systems, institutions, and coping mechanisms we rely on to navigate suffering. Today, we try to work past tragedy through resilience. We tend to view suffering as something that can be processed, understood, and eventually overcome. We medicalize trauma into conditions, process grief through therapy, and wield our self-awareness to turn horrible events into manageable frameworks. But Hereditary cruelly inverts this belief. Instead of rationality and emotional processing offering an escape, they serve the forces of fate. The more the Grahams try to make sense of their suffering, the deeper they fall into the cult's web. The movie is basically about a woman who had a traumatic childhood, was diagnosed by professionals in an effort to frame and treat her trauma, only for the cult to use that understanding as a convenient cover to perpetuate evil. At the beginning, Annie claims her mother had dissociative identity disorder.
She had DID, which became extreme at the end.
But that was probably her allowing demons like Payman to possess her. You know, like this.
Hello?
Mom?
Annie claims her father died from psychotic depression,
Because he had psychotic depression. And he starved himself.
but it's more likely that he was driven to such drastic measures by the cult. Her brother left a note saying his mom was trying to put people inside him, a true statement in fact, but it was labeled schizophrenia.
My older brother had schizophrenia, and when he was 16, he hanged himself in my mother's bedroom, and her accusing her of putting people inside him.
Annie supposedly sleepwalks, even having once almost burned her children, but that too was probably a result of demonic meddling. Peter experiences visions that push him to the brink, but they're dismissed as potential symptoms of inherited mental illness. This is the genius of the film. It, in a sense, reverses Nietzsche's lament. Instead of tragedy dying in the wake of rationality, Hereditary shows how tragedy re-emerges through rationality's impotence. It's Greek tragedy in the era of metatheater. It's not just that the Grahams are fated, it's that fate disguises itself as freedom, rationality, and control. The film subtly signals this return to the conventions of Greek tragedy through a clever stylistic choice. At a key moment, it breaks from the traditional horror film's reliance on subjectivity and embraces a more objective perspective, like a play. See, horror films thrive on immersing us in the character's subjectivity. Unlike a Greek tragedy, cinema allows us to experience events from a character's point of view. For example, The Shining. Whenever we encounter one of the hotel's creepy spirits, we intercut between the apparition and a close-up of the character's reaction, indicating that we are experiencing the scene from within a character's delusion. And for the most part, horror films follow this structure. We only know what the characters know, and our understanding is shaped by their experiences. But Sophocles' tragedies depend heavily on dramatic irony, where the audience knows the truth long before the protagonist does, making the tragic downfall feel all the more inevitable and excruciating. It's a lot more painful seeing Oedipus marry his mom when we know it's his mom. For the bulk of Hereditary, we know and see what the Grahams do. We share their confusion, their grief, and their growing sense of dread. But at the end of the second act, something shifts. When Annie goes to Joan's apartment to question her about the seance, the camera breaks from her perspective and pulls back to reveal the inside of the apartment. Empty, but unmistakably the site of a demonic ritual. this isn't a subjective shot from another character's perspective. It's an objective view, like looking down on a miniature or watching an event on a stage. We now know that events are not being warped by mental illness before the Grahams do. From that point on, we see stage-like objective shots and pity Annie like we pity Heracles, as Aster has stepped outside the logic of horror movies and brought us into the logic of a Greek tragedy. Also, it's quite interesting when you consider Hereditary as being in conversation with some of the other popular horror films of that time that, on a subtextual level, cast horror as a metaphor for the gruelingly difficult work of processing trauma. For example, in The Babadook, the titular monster embodies the mother's unresolved grief and depression, or in the Netflix series The Haunting of Hill House, the ghosts are also ghosts in the sense that they represent lingering pain. The idea is essentially that facing your trauma is the most horrifying thing, but Ari Aster says, hold my beer. It's much more terrifying if the prospect of redemption through hard work is the thing that ultimately dooms you. Or compare it with other media of the time that's deemed nihilistic. The typical narrative goes like this: we invent supernatural stories to shield ourselves from a cold, indifferent reality. The supernatural is a comforting lie, a way to impose meaning where there is none. But Hereditary proposes that the real comforting lie is the belief in a rational, mechanical universe where everything can be explained, because it allows us to believe that our suffering follows rules and that we might even have some agency over it. But Hereditary strips even that away, revealing a world that isn't merely indifferent, it's predatory. Ari is a very sick puppy, and I love him for it. Hereditary essentially revives the cruelty of Greek tragedy, the inescapability of fate, but updates it for a world that no longer believes in gods, only in rationality. So, one last time, let's revisit Peter's teacher.
If we go by the rule that the hero is undone by his fatal flaw, what is Heracles' flaw?
Arrogance?
Okay, why?
So if Heracles' fatal flaw was arrogance, what is the Graham family's arrogance? Heracles was the ultimate badass. He was a warrior, a demigod, a man of pure action, and despite all his strength, he was still reduced to a pawn of fate. While Heracles relied on brute force, we rely on our ability to dissect, diagnose, and intellectualize our struggles, convinced that understanding trauma can help us master it. But the true horror of Hereditary is that it faces us with the question, what if all of that is just hubris? What if, like Heracles, Orestes, or Annie, trauma cannot be processed? What if it can only be endured? Hey y'all, thanks for watching. Thanks again to Mando for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check them out and use the code Jared for over 40% off the starter pack bundle. Also be sure to subscribe, because the next video is on Get Out. Hope you guys are having a great spring. Take it easy. Peace.